Greetings to the Armenian Shakespeare Conference, and thanks to Jasmine and the conference committee for inviting me to address you. I'm sorry I can't do it in person. I've been asked to talk about recent productions of Macbeth, so I need to apologize for not talking about the two most recent ones that you are likely to have heard of. The one in Manchester with Ralph Fiennes and Indira Varma, I only saw in the filmed version, which you can probably see yourselves. I did go in person to the one in London with David Tennant and Cush Jumbo, but most of its effect came from the use of sound. Audiences listened in on headphones, and it would be hard to convey anything about it in a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to start with a quick reminder of the play's early history in the theatre. This is because I think it's important to remember that although people have always liked Macbeth, they have liked very different Macbeths. You can see from this slide that Macbeth wasn't printed until nearly 20 years after its first performance, so it's likely that the text as we have it had already been revised by then, and it's generally thought that Thomas Middleton added some songs and dances for the witches, since one of them is also found in his own play, The Witch. Then, as you know, there was a break in theatrical history because the London theatres were closed for a long period when the Civil War broke out, and they remained closed under the Commonwealth and the military rule under Oliver Cromwell. It was a period of dramatic changes. The king was beheaded in 1649. His son, Charles II, was restored to the throne in 1660. Not long after the Restoration, William Davenant, who was the manager of one of the newly opened theatres, wrote an adaptation of Macbeth. We actually have reviews of it because Samuel Pepys saw it and commented on it in his famous diary. In fact, he went to it a total of 8 times because he liked it so much. So in December of 1666, he wrote, "From hence to the Duke's house," that is the playhouse, "and there saw Macbeth, most excellently acted, and a most excellent play for variety." And then only a week later, really, "and thence to the Duke's house, and saw Macbeth, which, though I saw it lately, yet appears a most excellent play in all respects, but especially in divertissement, though it be a deep tragedy, which is a strange perfection in a tragedy, it being most proper here and suitable." What Pepys means by divertissement is that there was a lot of extra music and dancing in the witches' scenes. But he's also right in saying that the play works like a deep tragedy. Imagine how it would have looked to audiences who had lived through the execution of a king and the rule of Oliver Cromwell, who, from their point of view, was a murderer and a usurper, just like Macbeth. In the Restoration theatre, boys no longer played female roles, but Shakespeare's plays didn't have enough female characters for the popular actresses of the period. So one of Davenant's main changes was to build up the Macduff couple and to make Lady Macduff almost as important as Lady Macbeth. She's not there just for her sex appeal, which is what people often say when they critique this play. Macduff relies on her judgment, and later he calls her his dearest friend. Here is a short extract from the scene in which she persuades him that he ought not to lead a rebellion against Macbeth, because this would make him just as evil as the person he deposed. So he says, "My country's dangers call for my defense against the bloody tyrant's violence." To which she replies, "I am afraid you have some other end than merely Scotland's freedom to defend. You'd raise yourself whilst you would him dethrone, and shake his greatness to confirm your own. That purpose will appear when rightly scanned, but usurpation at the second hand." Her argument, which is perfectly intelligent, explains why Macduff decides to leave her and give his support to Malcolm, the legitimate heir. Now, Davenant cut the scene between her and her son, and her death is only reported, but we see quite a bit of her in this play. In the course of the 18th century, Shakespeare's text was gradually restored, and this restoration version isn't performed anymore except as a curiosity. The scene between the Macduffs would have been relevant to a Restoration audience. Some of them may have felt guilty about not taking action against Cromwell. But it soon looked dated, and so did the rhyming couplets, which were standard in the early Restoration. But a lot of Davenant's changes carried over, even when the original Shakespeare text was performed. The scene between Lady Macduff and her son was cut, so were the murderers, which meant that Lady Macduff disappeared completely from the play, and audiences heard about the murder of someone they'd never met. Productions also kept a lot of the Restoration music and dancing. The three speaking witches were played by men, because no one wanted to see lovely actresses made up to look old and ugly. And now that women were playing women, the effect of men playing women was comic. In fact, the witches were often played by the company's low comedians because there was nothing else for them to do in the play, since Davenant had cut the porter's scene, and it remained cut well into the 20th century. Since this genuine comedy was cut, audiences tended to laugh instead at the witches and at feeble stage effects like the ghost of Banquo coming up through a trap door. It was only at the end of the 19th century that the actor Henry Irving had the witches played by women in order to make the play more consistently tragic. And what about Macbeth and his wife? The theater in the 18th and 19th centuries was dominated by the leading actor, usually a tragedian, who cut the text and directed the play, and naturally he wanted to play a sympathetic character. One way that an actor becomes more tragic is to have a death speech. Shakespeare didn't give Macbeth one. Davenant gave him one line, which is clearly sort of political. Farewell, vain world, and what in it's most vain? Ambition. Garrick, nearly 100 years later, who was cutting the text as well as directing the play, gave himself much more of a death speech. 'Tis done, the scene of life will close. Ambition's vain, delusive dreams are fled, and now I wake to darkness, guilt, and horror. I cannot bear it. Let me shake it off. It will not be. My soul is clogged with blood and cannot rise. I dare not ask for mercy. It is too late. Hell drags me down. I sink. I sink. Oh, my soul's lost forever. Now, one way to make Macbeth more sympathetic was, of course, to blame everything on his wife. And just these pictures, I think, of various actors as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth can show you how the woman tends to dominate. In the first case, it's because David Garrick was actually a rather small man, and the actress playing opposite him looks as if she can drag him off the stage. The second example, Sarah Siddons, who is acting with her brother, John Philip Kemble, was so powerful that people swore they could smell blood in the scenes where she appeared. And in the picture of the Victorian couple, who were in fact man and wife, her costume in itself is enough to make it look as if she is running the whole show. It's interesting that this interpretation really suited both performers, the powerful Lady Macbeth dragging her husband off the stage, because it made Macbeth more sympathetic, less guilty, and it allowed the actress to get applause for demonstrating a kind of power that she wasn't allowed in real life. Then these four 19th century Macbeths, Edmund Kean, Charles Kean, William Macready, and Edwin Booth, acted in very different ways, but as you can see from these pictures, they all look sort of haunted and they have a kind of heroic grandeur. And this is what audiences expected. They also expected beautiful scenery, which gave a lot of the atmosphere of the play, even if this meant they had to wait a long time between scenes until the sets were changed. Okay, well, after this brief survey, I'm going to jump ahead to the period which I've lived through myself. In some ways, the late 20th century Macbeth was easier to perform than in the past because modern stage technology allows directors to have it both ways. They can have spectacular visual effects and they can move the action along quickly. Now we're used to horror films as well, and also to comic horror, and we can fit Macbeth into that category. We don't find the supernatural funny. We are actually prepared to be scared by it, though in a rather different way, I think, from earlier audiences. But in spite of this, most productions of Macbeth that I saw in the last century even when great actors were playing them, which they often did, were pretty unsuccessful. Modern dress created problems. How could you replace the sword fight that used to be the most exciting part of the play? After the sleepwalking scene, the end can be something of a letdown. And this was a period when critics started to ask whether actors could achieve the sort of cosmic grandeur, which I think you can sort of see in these pictures, and which writers often evoke when they talk about earlier productions. If you let Macbeth behave like a hero, it outrages our moral sense now. After all, he's a murderer and a tyrant. On the other hand, it's boring to watch a cowardly, unimpressive Macbeth for 5 acts. If he's not impressive, the play isn't tragic. One exception to the series of Macbeth failures was the Trevor Nunn production for the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1976 with Ian McKellen and Judi Dench. But the reason this worked was that it was really a play about marriage and a couple who were very much in love. Macbeth's men worshipped him. We saw this because when he arrived at Duncan's court to be rewarded, the sergeant, who was still present, rushed up and kissed his hand. His men obviously thought of him as a great general. But the very fact that the couple loved each other so much led them into a kind of temporary madness. Judi Dench thought the spirits actually did take her over in the first part of the play, and then that when she saw what became of Macbeth after the murder, the gap that opened up between them, she no longer had anything to live for. After the sleepwalking scene, she says the audience shouldn't be surprised when they find that she's dead. We watch this couple really descend into hell, and the fall was tragic because they'd fallen from a great height. This intimate staging and the emphasis on marriage showed the way forward, and many of the best later productions have followed this example. They're mostly modern dress, or at least not medieval or Renaissance, and sometimes they aim for a kind of timelessness. This is the 1999 production with Anthony Sher and Harriet Walter, another intimate one. And both of these actors are very good writers, so you can actually read their views of the play. I've put the references on the screen here. Harriet Walter has argued against that older view that Macbeth was basically a good man who never would have committed murder if his wife hadn't dragged him into it. Her view was that neither of them would have done the deed on their own, but that together they were a deadly combination. In rehearsal, they spent a lot of time discussing whether the Macbeth couple ever had a child. This is, of course, one of the big controversies about the play. And they finally decided that there had been one child, or perhaps even more children, who had died, and that the effect had been so traumatic that they'd never spoken of it until the point at which she uses as her last weapon to make Macbeth take action. Children and the tragedy of childlessness has become very important in a lot of recent productions. Some productions in this century have put even more emphasis on making the characters realistic in modern terms. This one you might have seen because, as you can see, it was made into a film after being seen at Chichester and then in London. And what people remember best about this production is probably the scene in which Macbeth was talking with the murderers and at the same time making himself a ham sandwich. These photos come from the film version, but when I saw it on stage, the set was a basement kitchen where the Macbeths could wash off their blood in the sink, and there was a refrigerator where Macbeth could get the makings of his sandwich, and there was also a dumb waiter, which is that lift-like thing on the right at the top. That's a lift for transporting food to the upstairs restaurant, and that's what Banquo's ghost arrived in. The horror, in fact, in this came from seeing familiar people and objects turning into something sinister. At the beginning, you see the left-hand right, the top image on the left, at least I think it's at the left on your side too. We saw the wounded sergeant on a hospital gurney being treated by 3 nurses while he gave his speech about the battle. But then once the king and the court had left, the nurses strangled the patient. And then they spoke the witch's opening lines, and we realized who they really were. This is an example of the familiar becoming really creepy. Macbeth was Patrick Stewart, who is internationally famous for playing a basically nice, reassuring character in a TV series. The fact that he was obviously a lot older than his wife made her fit into the category of glamorous trophy wife of a dictator. He also looked for the humor in the part. You can see that the general direction of productions of Macbeth up to this point had pretty much been toward making them as gloomy and tragic as possible, getting rid of the humor even when it was written into the play. But here, he was discovering lots of lines that could come across as black comedy. For example, I mean, it's now become quite a common laugh line. When Lennox has just described the awful events of the night of Duncan's murder, howling, screams, high winds, etc., Macbeth replies, "'Twas a rough night." And these days he tends to get a laugh for that because it's the understatement of the year. I don't remember finding anything tragic about this production, but it was consistently entertaining, which is more than you can say for some Macbeths. Much of what we tend to admire in Macbeth when we read it is really its poetry, and productions like this one often get criticized for not being poetic. That's partly because even the setting, as you can see, is unpoetic, and the poetic effect in productions is more likely to come from the appearance of the play than from the words. Audiences often can't really take in poetic language. However, there are examples of a poetic setting. Here, for example, this is the Wanamaker Theatre, the indoor theatre at the Globe, which is a beautiful space in its own right, and especially by candlelight. In this production, the Macbeths were played by a husband and wife, Michelle Terry and Paul Reddy, and the production emphasized their closeness and also their shared fear. These photos actually bring out a bit more than the spectators can actually see by candlelight, and that's especially true of actors' facial expressions. A lot more tends to happen through sound in this theater. For example, Banquo's ghost, the lower right, is looking here as if he was absolutely delighted at being able to join the feast, even in spite of being dead. I didn't remember seeing that smile when I was in the theater. But the production really worked through sound effects. And of course, one advantage of the Wanamaker is that the audience can be plunged into complete darkness. And that's how it created its most frightening effect. There were no witches. I mean, they were not cast, and we never saw them, but we heard them. The cast members all made weird sounds from different parts of the auditorium. And the fact that we didn't know the source or where they would come from next added to the unsettling feeling. You could describe this Macbeth as a play about fear of the dark. And this is another production, Jarl Farber at the Almeida, which was quite poetic in its way, although very strange, but quite haunting. In this, there was really no set, or the set consisted of things like that tap of running water where Lady Macbeth is seen washing her hands. There was also fire and even some earth on the stage. I think there was some allusion to the four elements, probably. There was also a bed where you saw Lady Macbeth lying at one point. And when the tap was turned on near the end, it sort of flooded the stage and people were wading through it. The witches were all women. They were played as a chorus. You can see them on the left there. They didn't really react to the situation. As you can see, they were sort of expressionless. And they weren't either malevolent or comic. They certainly weren't comic. And they were present in quite a lot of scenes, even where they're not actually meant to be. All the men were large and tough looking, and they were played by Scottish actors in kilts. And Lady Macbeth, a very well-known Irish actress, Cerise Ronan, looked quite sort of frail beside them, as you can see, I think. What was really interesting in this production was the treatment of Lady Macduff. She was a much more important character than usual. She and her children, who were much older than they're usually played, were present at Macbeth's castle in the beginning, and she sang at the dinner where Duncan was present. We associated her with singing and with music, and she was actually singing Middleton's words. This is where we get an interesting throwback, really, to the 17th century. when Lady Macbeth collapsed after the murder, and it was played as a real kind of collapse, not as a fake, Lady Macduff and her children comforted her. And the song itself, come away, Hecate, Hecate, oh, come away, we lack but you, we lack but you, came up again later. There was obviously some real bonding between these two women. And this was the big surprise in the production, when normally a servant comes to warn Lady Macduff that some danger is approaching her, in this production it was Lady Macbeth herself. She was also present during the murder, and we could assume that this is what drove her mad. The murderers, of course, paid no attention to her. They hardly could. And it's possible that we were meant to think that the whole episode was only happening in her mind, that it was a result of her having realized what Macbeth was going to do. Later, we saw her lying at the back of the stage as Macbeth talked of her illness, and after the sleepwalking scene, she heard the singing again off stage with that refrain, we lack but you. And she went off stage to join the singer, who of course was dead. Everything sort of frail and beautiful in this play was finally destroyed. In the final tableau, we saw a young Fleance with a machine gun, looking like a smaller version of Macbeth. So the cycle of violence would go on. As you can see, by the time the text had been moved around in this way, this became really more of an adaptation than a production. And the same could be said of my last example, which is the version I saw at the Globe in 2023. The staging here, you can see the set on the left before people came on, deliberately concealed the beauty of the theater. I mean, if it resembled anything, it was a kind of barren space dominated by dead trees. Later, they brought on various gurneys and things that looked like part of a hospital or maybe a mortuary. Of course, the Globe can't do stage lighting at all. It's either natural light or in the evening, it's just an unvaried bright light illuminating the whole stage. So it couldn't create any atmosphere in an artificial way. It set the ugliness of the stage, because I think you can see everything is ugly, including the costumes, particularly Lady Macbeth's blue outfit in the picture lower left. In the scene where they come on after the coronation. But they set this against some very beautiful choral music, which we kept hearing, and which, I don't know, if it seemed to contrast the sort of beauty of a sort of poetic effect with the general ugliness of what we were seeing. A lot of reviewers complained that the Macbeths were not a very attractive or interesting couple, and that was certainly the point of the production. But it wasn't very fair to the actors, who kept getting blamed for not being impressive when they obviously weren't meant to be. When Duncan arrived at the house, and Duncan was played as a queen, not a king, one could see that the Macbeths were not even ready for a royal visit. They were just embarrassed by it, and everybody was sort of embarrassed. When Banquo made his famous speech about the temple haunting martlet, the birds in the area around Dunsinane, it was clear that he was trying to kill time while they all wondered where the host and hostess were. And then Lady Macbeth finally turned up, pulling on her jacket in a hurry, and tried to cover for the fact that Macbeth wasn't even there. So not surprisingly, a lot of these scenes got laughs. This often happens at the Globe anyway. If you've been there, you'll know that audiences want to react audibly and feel part of the production and seize every possible opportunity to laugh. There were, in fact, opportunities to, because of the way that the text had been played with. But the audience did go quiet when Lady Macbeth spoke about her child, and that's because of the way the play opened. It began not with the witches, but with Macbeth and his wife down front holding a rolled up bundle, which looked, of course, like a baby. And then in the background, the chorus was singing a setting of lines that came from a completely different play, Richard III. Sorrow breaks seasons and reposing hours, makes the night morning and the noontide night. And you realize that this was saying something about the effect of sorrow on inversion, makes the night morning and the noontide night. Think of the language of the play, fair is foul and foul is fair. And uh, and the tree that at the beginning had been upright was inverted. I'm still not sure how that happened because somehow I didn't take it in. But as you can see, there's an inverted tree behind other characters throughout the rest of the play. And that was this idea of inversion, that everything had changed because of sorrow. At the end of that scene, in fact, the couple turned and went upstage, and this rolled up bundle unrolled, and you realize they no longer had a child, and that was sort of the point of this. And I suppose we could imagine that the rest of the action of the play was the result of their shared grief, which had never found a proper outlet, or perhaps the energy of they needed something to fill the emptiness of their lives. And as if to twist the knife further, when Lady Macduff arrived, you see her there on the picture in the bottom. She was obviously pregnant. She was with her daughter, who again is quite a bit older. It was a daughter because this production was creating as many female roles as possible. The apparitions in the cauldron scene were also all children, and we also had the young Fleance and, of course, young Seward, who is usually at least an adolescent, somewhere around 20, but in this production was very, very young indeed. So there was a lot of emphasis again on children as the kind of threat to Macbeth. The most original part of the production was probably the witches. They were played by men in this time, and they emerged from the audience. They appeared in, well, the basic costume, as you can see, is, I suppose, what's called a hazmat or hazardous materials costume for dealing with dangerous elements. And they were both funny and scary. In the cauldron scene, for example, one of them was looking at a recipe book. It was kind of a cross between an autopsy and a cooking show. Another was finding the ingredients, mainly getting them out of a dead body. And a third was mixing them in a blender. And you can see down there that at one point he had trouble getting the blender to start, and then he muttered, technology, which of course was a laugh line. There were other laughs when Macbeth, for example, told the murderers about dogs and mentioned, instead of the ones mentioned in the text, cockapoos and Rottweilers. The witches took on other roles as well, and in a particularly sinister scene, the sleepwalking scene, they were the ones listening to Lady Macbeth. Shakespeare, of course, makes both the lady in waiting and the doctor respond to her horrible revelations with a mixture of horror and compassion. But here, she was observed just by these three men, and one of them was the doctor, when he said, "Infected minds to their deaf pillows will discharge their secrets." What he meant was that she needed to be silenced, as she is here, to keep her from giving too much away. So we knew that the later report of her suicide was a cover-up. Now, this kind of transposing of lines from one character to another, deliberately making them mean something different, is another way in which a production becomes an adaptation of the original. Modern directors are doing something very similar to what Davenant did in the 17th century, but for different reasons. Like him, they want to give more parts to women, which is why there's increasing emphasis on Lady Macduff, even though she's often just a silent presence, or, as in the Almeida production, a singer. In the Globe production, there were quite a few female characters to make up for the fact that the witches were men. On the other hand, this emphasis makes the female element a contrast with the world of evil. But the more we see of Lady Macduff, of course, the more shocking her death is going to be. If the 19th century showed bossy women pushing nice, sensitive men into committing murder, the 21st century seems to focus more on the idea of codependency. So this brings me to the question in your call for papers, where is the milk of human kindness? And it's particularly relevant to these recent productions. As you know, human kindness does not really have anything to do with kindness in the modern sense. It means something more like human nature, though I suppose there is the question of whether human nature is naturally kind. So these modern productions generally depict the Macbeth couple as belonging to humankind. That is, they're not exceptional, heroic figures. They're ordinary human beings. But then what are ordinary human beings really like? Perhaps we're all as potentially evil as Macbeth and his wife and don't need a prophecy from witches to make us behave badly. This denial of the supernatural or the superhero affects how we feel at the end of the play. A professor in the Czech Republic once told me that in the early 1990s, Macduff's words, "The time is free," summed up the feelings of the Czech audience after the fall of the communist regime and the beginning of a new era. Davenant was writing at a similar time, soon after the restoration of the British monarchy, when everyone was full of hope for the future. In his version, the last lines of the play, in a typical rhyming couplet, are spoken by Macduff to Malcolm. His vice, that is Macbeth's, will make your virtue shine more bright, as a fair day succeeds a stormy night. It's typical of that cynical period that one could take these lines to mean that any ruler would look good by comparison with Macbeth, and Davenant's audience would already have found out that Charles II was anything but perfect. But I think it's significant that so very few modern productions express much optimism about Malcolm as a ruler. At the Globe, after Macduff had heard Malcolm claim that his life so far had been totally chaste, he muttered, "Weirdo." Macbeth used to be a play about a uniquely evil pair of murderers. Now, I think, most productions see them only as part of an evil system. The theater reflects modern distrust of the military, of political leaders, and perhaps of the future itself. And this isn't really surprising, is it?